I just want to, I was struck by the poem and then the wonderful story about Chandakirti and the shopkeeper, and then your elaboration of that story. And I think what I'm trying to get at here is what is the difference between the poem and the story and your elaboration of the story? Have you done something different than the poem did or that the story did when you elaborate on the story the way you did? I don't know if you have or not, but I don't think you have. And I don't think to talk about the power of the poem or the power of the story of the shopkeeper with Chandakirti as a power in its own right is to hit someone over the head or give them a drug. I don't think it's the same kind of thing.
Of that, I was trying to persuade Sandy that he can have the points he wants to make about how this text works without having to disagree with Jay's point, that attending to the things about how this text is used, and this applies to Connie's paper as well, I especially think of these two papers in connection with the point I have. Attending to the work this text does on the reader in any of the various ways it might do so is a logically distinctive kind of thing from asking about its semantic content. I totally agree with Jay that if we're interested in the semantic content, if we're interested in understanding what this text says and what it means in a sort of strict sense of what meaning would be, there's no way to talk about that except in terms of reason. To talk about the meaning of the text just is to talk about the sense it makes for these claims to be made. And, but that's not mutually exclusive of attending to the work the text does on it, because how or whether people are moved by arguments is a completely different thing than the content of the arguments. So for example, Jay's point isn't or ought not to be in emphasizing reason that its status as an exercise in reason is sort of coercive. Its being a sound argument, for example, wouldn't consist in its forcing everybody to assent to it. That's not how reason works. So if you're going to understand, you have to talk about it in terms of reasoning, but that's a logically distinctive kind of question from what I take it you're totally appropriately interested in, which is how might this text move people? And what are the various practices in the context of which it could do its work?
When you say move people, are you talking about something like I think Jay was just talking about when he talked about transformation or something?
Yeah. I mean to refer to the whole range of possible transformative effects.
And so is that the kind of thing that could be accomplished by the poem that Peter read?
Sure. Mm-hmm. Yeah. That this text is a total mindfuck, for example, for somebody, and that has transformative effects for them, may have to do with the semantic content of it. It may have to do with other things about it, but it's doing that kind of work is a different kind of question than questions about what it means. And they're not, if those two things are properly understood, I think it will be understood that they're not mutually exclusive.
Now, I guess I agree completely. I mean, it's one thing to give a psychological or a soteriological account of why a text is efficacious for a person, of why some people listen to Cohen's poem and are instantly awakened, and some people listen to it and say, what? And some people look at Nagarjuna's Mula Madhyamaka Karaka and say, my God, I now see the world as empty, and are completely awakened. And other people say, bunch of logic chopping Indian bullshit. I mean, different people react to texts in different ways, right? Me, I like logic chopping Indian bullshit, and it works for me. But for some people, they look at it and they say, I don't see why you're wasting your time on this.
Well, one way I've talked before about, one idiom for talking about the logical independence from one another of these two kinds of questions is to talk about the difference between truth and justification. The truth of the claims in the text is an objective sort of question. Whether we can arrive at that is a separate question. But if it makes sense to say there's something the text means, that's a question sort of independent of us. We're constrained by the text. What we're justified in believing about it, given what's epistemically available to us and the practices we're engaged in, is a logically separate kind of question. That's a fact about us. So psychological facts having to do with our complex psychosocial histories and those facts as they bear on our reception or use of the text are also part of the world in which texts like this are used. And there's no contradiction in recognizing all of those things.
Because I was a bit flip a moment ago. There's a deeper point here actually about path. And this is something that connects to things that Slava was saying yesterday, and I think also to things that Karen was saying yesterday in a different way. And that is, there is a legitimate disagreement among various Buddhist traditions about, and this is about justification, which is why I'm piggybacking here, about whether you need the analytic, rational, inferential logic chopping in order for direct experience to make any sense, or whether you could choose one versus the other, or whether you need to have some direct experience before the logic chopping is actually going to be good for you. And we know that there are Buddhist traditions that endorse each of those four positions. The position, that I grow up in is one that says, do the logic before you get to the experience, because having an experience, you don't know whether you're having the right experience or not, right? You have no idea how to use that experience unless you've already got inferential cognition. Other people look at that and say, well, that's screwy. I mean, what's the point of doing the logic if it's not to process a profound experience that you've had? And other people say, you know what, the logic takes a lot of time to go directly to the, we all know how those things go. So there is a big path issue here. There's a big path issue here. And I'm not in a position to judge the path issue. No. That one requires George.
One thing that you're glossing over is the fact that in your perspective, I assume, you do need to give an account of what counts as a good reason and what counts as a bad reason, separate from the fact of whether they work pragmatically or not. Right?
The one point I have persistent reservations about is the characterization of the project in terms of skepticism. Because I'm inclined to see a pretty strong claim to the effect not just that projects in fundamental ontology don't work, I think that's exactly the right characterization, but that a project in fundamental ontology cannot work. I take the arguments to, at the end of the day, involve something like the mode of necessity. No account that bottoms out in ontological primitives can coherently be given. So you get back to the robust truth claim at the end of the day when you talk about the contradictions at the limits of thought. I would say that figures a little, I would front load that a bit more and say this is a metaphysical argument.
So I take the Pyrrhonian modes to actually demonstrate just what you said, though I also agree that no Pyrrhonian would ever assent to that.
Which one you think is more? I mean, in a way, what Dan was saying, in a kind of taking the no view more seriously, becomes a kind of provisional description, whereas the no view seemed to be more what is sought to be achieved by the transformation, right? So in a way, if you take this kind of dialectical process, the no view is closer to where you want to get, right?
Is the content of an argument separate from the realm of human communication? It seems as if you want to, not just you, but Jay is suggesting that there are fundamental laws of human communication which are objectively true outside of a context of human communication, such as the law of the excluded middle, etc. And that seems to be a fundamental project, a fundamental, not ontology, but something about communication. And I'm thinking of the Vimalakirti Sutra, in which there is a universe, I forget the name of it, something Ganda, in which the Buddha...
Sugandha?
Sarva Sugandha?
Sweet smelling.
Also,
Where the Buddha said communicate.
the Buddha communicates through, we might say, pheromones, through perfumes. And is there a law of excluded middle in this communication? So how universal can we talk about reason outside of outside of the realm of human communication? And to separate it, this kind of reasons and good reasons outside of human beings seems to me to be a kind of essentialism of communication. And I'm quite sure that Nagarjuna would not go along with that, because language is empty and meaning is empty. And
I agree completely. There's no need to make that transcendent move. Remember the important verse, right? Without depending upon convention, you can't teach the ultimate without understanding the ultimate. The dependence on convention is important, and part of the structure of the conventional world in which we are operating, if we are writing text and talking, is one that involves the conventions of speaking and talking, and conventions of arguing and debating, and conventions of reasoning. If you're not playing that game, then you've got it. It's as though if you and I are playing chess, you might say, there's another game you can play on this board called drafts, and the rules are different. Why don't we do that? Then I would say, well, that's fine, but then we're playing a different game. We're not playing chess with those rules. But remember, I'll come back to something I said a little earlier. I think of philosophy in the Buddhist context as a practice, and it's a textual practice. And part of textual practice is reasoning and offering arguments, and there's nothing wrong with that, just so you don't think that those transcend the practice in which they're offered. But you're absolutely right, that's essential. And I do think that's part of what's going on in the Vimalakirti as well, and that's part of what's going on in a lot of Buddhist rhetoric of ineffability. That effing, really gets you a long way, and it's a perfectly okay practice. But sometimes you have to shut the F up.